Zhu awoke in pitch-black darkness. The woman was completely disoriented. She had no idea where she was located. Her nostrils were practically corroded by a repulsive, nauseating odor. Cautiously feeling the space around her, Zhu encountered something alive, squirming beneath her fingers. She instinctively pulled her hand back. As her eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness, Zhu observed bodies, lifeless bodies, piled on top of one another. The faces of some were frozen in silent screams. Where was she and what had occurred? How could she escape from here? Thoughts flashed one after another in her mind, but the woman couldn't concentrate. Her feet were sinking into a disgusting sludge, accumulated from the decomposition of dead human corpses. One Saturday afternoon in November 1990, a 26-year-old kindergarten teacher named Lixia sat crying on a bench at the train station in Nihe, a town located in northwestern Heilongjiang province, China. The woman had left her husband for good just a couple of hours earlier. Their marriage could never be described as happy from the start. They quarreled over every trivial matter, but that morning, they had argued so fiercely that for Shu, it became the final straw. She rushed to the bedroom, tossed some belongings into a bag, and ran out of the house, wishing never to return. At that moment, she had no specific plan. She didn't know what she would do after leaving home. Only now did she realize she was sitting at the station, simply watching trains come and go. Shu suddenly became aware that there were very few passengers, and the platform was nearly deserted. By Chinese standards, Nihe, where Shu was considered tiny, though it had a population of 70,000. It was situated at the foot of a tall mountain, with farmlands growing wheat, soybeans, and corn on its outskirts. The city center had tall buildings, residential and commercial areas. Generally, even some Chinese people were unaware of Nihe's existence, let alone foreign visitors. However, in the months leading up to this moment, Nihe had unexpectedly made headlines in local news across China due to rather tragic events. The fact was that women had begun disappearing here. Not just one or two, but many more, with the count already reaching dozens. Lixia was aware of at least a dozen women who had vanished without a trace in Nihe over the past few months. When news of the mysterious disappearances hit the front pages, local women became afraid to leave their homes unaccompanied. Who knew what risks might be associated with being alone on the city streets? At this point, the police had no obvious leads regarding the strange vanishings, but many women were last seen at this very station where Shu now sat. In fact, every time Shu walked to work, she tried to stay close to other pedestrians to somehow ensure her safety if anything were to happen. The only thing that reassured her was that most of the missing women were involved in the sex industry. Although Shu was a kindergarten teacher and had no connection to ladies of the night, now, sitting alone on a bench at the empty station, she felt quite vulnerable. Of course, deep down she thought bad things only happened to others, but today she suddenly felt uneasy and realized she had acted quite rashly by running away from home. At one point, Shu decided she should return to the apartment and try to mend things with her husband, if only for her own safety. However, before she could stand up and leave the station, Shu noticed a young man at the other end of the platform. He was dressed in a handsome brown wool coat and stylish trousers, looking as if he had stepped off the cover of a fashion magazine. The stranger, catching Shu's gaze, slowly walked along the platform towards her. Without saying a word, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a tissue, and offered it to her, having noticed tears in her eyes. The distraught woman was at a loss and didn't know what to do. She looked up at the sky, then quickly glanced around. There was no one else on the platform besides the two of them. It seemed as if everything around had died out, and the space was gripped by an eerie silence. Shu didn't understand how she could have attracted the attention of such an imposing young man, but he kept a respectful distance from her. He didn't try to impose himself, just looked at her sympathetically and held out the tissue. It was a bit strange, suspicious, and even creepy. But as soon as the stranger spoke, all of Shu's anxiety instantly vanished. He asked if she was all right and if she needed any help. The man spoke so sincerely that Shu lowered her guard, took the tissue, and wiped her wet cheeks. Coming closer, the young man asked permission to sit down and inquired about the reason for her tears. It felt as if Shu had been waiting for this question. Without understanding how it happened, she dumped a load of her personal problems on the stranger. Her life over the last few months or even years of this terrible marriage had been a series of troubles. All her emotions, bottled up inside for a long time, simply poured out at this moment. The woman began to cry hysterically. Between sobs, she explained that she had left her husband today and had no idea what to do next. Her entire life had crumbled in an instant, and there seemed to be no light at the end of the tunnel. Friends, over 90% of viewers watch videos without subscribing to the channel. Check if you're subscribed. If not, please be so kind as to subscribe to the channel to support me. Finally, when Shu stopped talking about her troubles, she felt very embarrassed. But her companion didn't show any sign that this bothered him. The whole time, he listened attentively and nodded sympathetically. The man introduced himself. His name was Jiawenge. He said he was a factory director, so he could offer Shu a job to give her a chance to start over. Then he made a suggestion that caused Shu to panic. Jia invited the woman to his home so they could calmly discuss all matters regarding employment. Her suspicious look said it all. The man stood up and was about to leave when Shu unexpectedly stopped him and said she agreed. Perhaps her life at that moment seemed so insignificant to her that she was ready to take a risk and act recklessly. But the guy seemed so sincere and pleasant that she decided to trust him. Zhu and Jia stood up, walked silently along the platform, and made their way into the city. They went down the street, walked a couple of blocks, and as soon as they turned the corner, a beautiful house came into view. All her hesitations up to this point vanished at once because she saw a gorgeous red brick building, fully matching the style of her new acquaintance, equally well kept and modern. Jia led his guest to the kitchen, brewed tea himself, and began asking questions about work. He inquired about Shu's skills, considering what duties she could perform at his factory. After Shu finished her tea, Jia suddenly fell silent, as if waiting for the drink to take effect on the woman. His gaze also changed in an instant. Instead of sincere interest, a sinister gleam appeared in his eyes. Shu felt drowsy. Her eyelids grew heavy, her vision sharply deteriorated, and her last thought was that she had been poisoned. Then her mind clouded over, and Shu collapsed, lifeless. A couple of weeks later, a concerned elderly couple approached the police station to report a missing person. However, it wasn't about the kindergarten teacher. Although the woman had vanished 2 weeks ago, no one had reported her missing. Her husband assumed she had left him and gone somewhere. That's how he explained to Shu's employer why she hadn't shown up for work. The officer talking to the elderly couple wasn't at all surprised that someone else hadn't returned home. It was December 1990. Over the past 6 months, 20 young women involved in selling their own bodies had gone missing in Nihei. The police weren't even sure if they had actually been abducted or if they had simply boarded a train and left town to find work. Investigations were conducted, but since there were no leads, no one really searched for them. Only this time, it wasn't about a woman. A businessman had gone missing. However, the details of his disappearance were frighteningly similar to all those escort workers. The guy was last seen at the same railway station where Shu met Jia, so now the investigator began to wonder if this missing man was connected to the vanished ladies of the night and decided it was just a coincidence. By January 1991, 5 more people had gone missing in Nihei, 2 women and 3 men. Now the police had no chance to write it off as these people leaving for work. In total, 26 people, men and women, disappeared in broad daylight without leaving any traces. Finally, in early spring, the Nihei police formed a task force and began investigating all these disappearances. But surprisingly, no bodies or signs that these people were no longer alive were found. No additional information, as if they simply didn't exist in nature. All the police knew was that 26 people had vanished, not counting Lixia, and many of them were last seen at the railway station. It got to the point where this story began to spread across China and turned into a crude joke. Tired of living, go to Nihei. People thought some terrible maniac was roaming the city streets and taking the lives of random passers-by. The investigation into the disappearances hadn't progressed at all by the end of summer 1991. The story spread throughout the country and grew more and more extensive, and the Nihei police still had absolutely no ideas about where these people had gone. The situation started to look much worse when sudden disappearances of people spread beyond the city. Citizens began to vanish in other towns located near Nihei, but everything was somehow connected to the railway line. By autumn of the same year, over 30 people were listed as missing, and the police, as before, had no witnesses or suspects. But everything changed on October 22, 1991. About a year after kindergarten teacher Lixia met Jia Wenge at the city station, and then drank poisoned tea in his house. On that autumn day, the police were conducting a routine check of passengers at a station near the city. This had nothing to do with the ongoing investigation. Patrols were simply stopping suspicious passers-by for public safety purposes and checking their IDs. At some point, one of the officers noticed a young, attractive guy on the platform in a brown wool coat, fashionable trousers, and expensive shoes. The stylish man stood out noticeably from the crowd with his appearance and clothes. When the stranger noticed the policeman's gaze on him, he hastily grabbed a bag, quickly turned around, and started to leave. At the same time, two other people near him did the same thing. They grabbed bags, quickly turned around, and began to move away. All this looked somewhat suspicious, so the police stopped all three and checked the contents of the bags. Inside were packets of prohibited substances. The trio stubbornly ignored the questions asked by the law enforcement officers, so the officers asked them to provide identification. The young man in the brown coat handed over his documents. They listed the same name, Jia Weng, which he had given when meeting Shu a year ago. All three were brought to the police station and began to be interrogated separately. Jia completely refused to comment on the contents of the bags. The second person also refused to cooperate. Then the officers decided to pressure the third and try to break him. It was very noticeable that he was more anxious than his accomplices. So after a short argument, this person began to talk. When the detained individual began to speak, it wasn't about what the investigators were interested in. According to him, the prohibited substances in the bags were trivial compared to what was happening in Jia Wenge's house. The eyes of the present police officers widened. If what this person said was true, the case of mysterious disappearances that had shocked the entire country would soon be solved. The next day, a phone call came into the Nihei police station. On the line was one of the officers who had detained the suspicious trio at the station. He provided local investigators with information that made them instantly drop everything and urgently head to the specified address. A group of 20 police officers and 10 forensic experts headed to Jia Wenge's house. From the outside, everything looked very respectable. A beautiful building standing a bit apart from other houses. A cozy yard with still blooming plants. But as soon as the officers and experts entered, they were hit by an acrid, unpleasant smell. Although the neat furnishings of the house raised no doubts about the owner's cleanliness, the stench, spreading through all the rooms, made it impossible to breathe deeply. As it turned out, the source of the horrible smell was the basement. The officers opened the door leading down, and all they could see was a dark room. But the odor coming from there was so unbearable that they had to hold their noses to avoid suffocating. 2 policemen nearly lost consciousness, and had to go outside to recover. Only after putting on respirators could they go down again. In fact, there was nothing in the basement room that could produce such a terrible smell. It was almost empty. Suddenly, one of those present illuminated a strange hole in the floor with a flashlight right in the middle of the room. And when the police looked into it, they couldn't believe what they saw. At the same time, the group conducting the search upstairs made an equally horrifying discovery. They found a video cassette containing terrible footage that explained what had been happening inside this house. But to understand this, let's go back a year, when Lixia met a handsome man at the station and went to his house to talk about employment. After drinking the tea containing some substance, the woman lost consciousness, but didn't die. Shu woke up several hours later in complete confusion and immediately sensed an acrid, nauseating smell. Since the room was pitch dark, Shu couldn't see anything. She carefully began to feel the space around her with her hands and felt stone everywhere she touched. Eventually, the woman realized she was at the bottom of a shallow well, but there was no water below. Instead, her feet sensed some sticky sludge resembling jelly. Shu tried to touch objects around her, but instinctively pulled her hand back when something moved under her fingers. The woman was utterly bewildered. Where was she? What happened? What smelled so terrible? In panic, she began to scream and call for help. Suddenly, the cover at the top of the well began to move, and some light entered the pit. At first, the woman looked up but saw nothing. Then her gaze shifted down to what surrounded her. At that moment, the hair on her head stirred with horror. Around her lay dead human bodies that had been thrown into this well. Many of them had already begun to rot and decompose, emitting a disgusting stench. The scene that suddenly unfolded before Shu made her nauseous and terrified her to death. The woman vomited several times, then screamed again in horror and pain. Only a strong desire to survive kept her sane. It turned out that the panic-stricken Shu had attracted the attention of the house owner. When Shu looked up again, she saw Jia's face, that attractive man she had met at the station. He stood above, looking at her with a sinister smile. The woman begged him to pull her out of this pit and promised to do anything he asked. The man thought for a moment, then reached down and pulled Shu out of the well to the surface. He decided that he could indeed use an accomplice. A few days later, Shu returned to the station where she first encountered Jia, though this time she was there alone. The woman unhurriedly approached the train platform, not intending to travel anywhere. She surveyed the few passengers waiting for the commuter train and noticed a man who appeared to be a businessman, judging by his professional demeanor. She then walked up to him, sat down nearby, and struck up a conversation. Minutes later, Shu was walking arm in arm with the businessman towards Jia Wenge's house. The woman led her guest to the kitchen and poured some tea. As soon as the man relaxed and lowered his guard, Shu crept up behind him and slipped a garrote around his neck. When the businessman lost consciousness, she and Jia dragged his body to a room on the ground floor. Jia Wenge grabbed a video camera and began filming as Shu climbed on top of the still living but unconscious person, lying on the basement floor, raised a knife, and plunged it into her victim's chest with all her might. It was this footage of Shu taking the life of a stranger, who would later be reported as missing, that was discovered by a police officer on the building's first floor during a search. Jia Wenge turned out to be a serial offender responsible for the disappearance of all these people from train stations and streets in Nihei City and the surrounding areas. He used various methods to persuade them to enter his home, then did terrible things to them, before simply dumping their dead or half-alive bodies into a pit in the middle of the basement room. So, who is Jia Wenge? How did this person become a monster? How did he manage to commit such horrific crimes right under the noses of law enforcement? Jia Wenge was born in Nihei, Heilongjiang Province in 1964. His family was typical of most in the area, not wealthy but hardworking. Both Jia's father and mother worked at a factory, and their monthly wages were sufficient to cover the family's expenses. His parents adored their son and did everything possible to meet his needs and interests. Jia was born intelligent, with a sharp mind. He was one of the top students. During his school years, the young man served on the class committee multiple times. After Jia Wengje completed junior high school, he took an ordinary job at the factory where his parents once worked. In those days, factory work was considered fairly stable. If Jia had continued to work diligently, a successful career and comfortable future would have awaited him. The boy's mother and father passed away very early, so there was no help to be expected. However, the initial trajectory of his life began to develop quite differently from what his parents had planned. His attractive appearance was to blame. Jia Wenge was naturally charming with alluring brown eyes, and as he matured, he became even more handsome and confident in his irresistibility, so that in his demeanor, he rivaled some screen stars. Jia dressed stylishly, spoke eloquently, and knew how to appeal to women. Many female factory workers fell under the spell of this young man, and Jia reveled in the feeling of being surrounded by hundreds of flowers, not knowing which to choose, so he pursued romances with several women simultaneously. Some of his lovers were still quite young. In those days, this was considered extremely scandalous. When the factory manager learned of his workers' affairs, he became very angry and issued stern warnings to everyone. However, no prohibitions could keep the girls from their tender feelings for Jia. The young man himself felt like he controlled women's fates and had no intention of giving this up, continuing to date female workers. When rumors of his romantic exploits again reached the manager's ears, he lost patience and fired Jia Wenge. Lacking any special skills, the guy took a job at a butcher shop to make ends meet. He slaughtered livestock and sold meat. Thanks to Jia's people skills, the business brought in more income each day. However, being spoiled by attention led the young man to frequently quarrel with other employees and argue at every turn. Whenever he was in a bad mood, he would go slaughter animals to calm down. The moment the knife touched fresh meat, he always experienced a strange pleasure. Additionally, Jia was naturally lazy and greedy for pleasures. So after some time, he quit working at the butcher shop. He began associating with local troublemakers, spending whole days in entertainment, throwing around his earnings left and right. Due to his debauchery, Jia visited local brothels every few days. His wife could no longer bear it and was forced to divorce him. However, this did not affect the young man's life at all. He felt not the slightest pang of conscience. At first, Jia simply engaged in small business with his friends to make a living, but gradually modest earnings ceased to satisfy him. Driven by greed, the guy began stealing chickens, ducks, sheep, and cattle. After each theft, he immediately returned to his former life so the police wouldn't track him down. It was this impunity that made Jia believe he would never be caught, and he felt invincible. The criminal group's ambitions grew, and they gradually moved from petty theft to robberies. When attacking people, Jia was always at the forefront, holding his butcher's knife at the ready. His entire demeanor in those moments expressed ferocity. After several successful robberies, the young man turned his attention to foreign traders. To conceal his true nature from people and avoid trouble, he began carrying out villainous acts alone. The remote location and poor transportation provided Jia with the necessary conveniences. To reach Nihe City, one had to get off the train, transfer to a bus to the provincial capital, then walk to the destination. At that time, people engaged in trade often carried cash. Whenever a new businessman arrived at the station, Jia pretended to be enthusiastic about helping him reach Nihe, while actually leading the trader to a secluded and remote place, robbing him, then taking extreme measures to silence the businessman forever. In the 1970s and 1980s, Nihe City in Heilongjiang Province essentially became a forbidden zone. After several cases of businessmen disappearing, many were reluctant to go there unless necessary. Fewer and fewer people came to Nihei to do business. Jia's criminal activities ceased to bring in income. He wandered aimlessly through the streets looking for suitable targets until one day he encountered a group of well-dressed women seeking clients for evening encounters. A spark of hope ignited in Jia's heart. Unlawful thoughts arose, and he began to act. Thanks to his attractive appearance and eloquence, the young man easily persuaded several women to go to his home. After intimate activities, Jia unexpectedly transformed from a gallant man into a butcher and asked the women to hand over all their valuables if they didn't want to say goodbye to life. The women obediently complied with the demands, after which they ended up in the basement one by one. After Jia's first successful operation, his desires began to spiral out of control. He started frequently indulging in this relaxed and gratifying method of retribution. From July to November 1990, in just 4 months, Jia single-handedly ended the lives of several individuals. Over time, the underground storage could no longer accommodate the number of victims. The homeowner had to dig a special well to dispose of the bodies. In just a few months, he was responsible for more than a dozen missing women. Then Jia Wenge's life trajectory changed again due to the appearance of a woman. Her name was Lixia. He met her at the station where she was distraught after an argument with her husband. In reality, Shu was destined for the same fate as the other women. However, she survived and became the monster's accomplice. At the moment her life was at stake, Shu made an agreement with Jia Wenge that she would do anything he asked. From that point on, the victim profile shifted from women selling themselves for money to random men. And the very first victim at Shu's hands was the businessman that the elderly couple was looking for. It was footage of this act that was captured on the tape found by police in Jia's house. This woman deceptively lured men into the house, where they were subsequently killed and robbed of all cash and valuable items. When summer arrived, the attacks in Nihei noticeably decreased. Due to hot weather, an unpleasant odor of decaying bodies began to spread from the cellar, which neighbors might eventually discover. At the same time, more and more plainclothes individuals appeared on city streets, observing the railway station and surrounding area. In this environment, Jia had to restrain himself for a while, but financial resources were depleting surprisingly quickly. A bold idea came to him. If it became dangerous to attack people in Nihei, they could go elsewhere. So he took Lixia and continued the series of crimes outside the city. During this time, they visited various places, taking several lives. But someday, it had to end. And on October 22nd, 1991, the strange behavior of the accomplices caught the attention of local police. The officers thought they had caught ordinary illegal substance dealers, not realizing they had in their hands a crazed maniac who had been terrorizing an entire city. In reality, Lixia wasn't the only person involved in Jia's criminal scheme. He managed to convince 2 others, including his ex-wife, to assist him in carrying out his acts. According to Hangzhou Railway Station police, the main culprits were 2 men and 1 woman, Jia Wenge, Li Xuhua, and Lixia, all from Heilongjiang province. In this well-planned operation, Shu was responsible for seducing men, while the other 2 controlled the victim. Later, the public wondered what kept people around Jia. All of Jia's accomplices had ample opportunities to escape and report everything to the police, but for some reason, they didn't. Even considering they were under complete control, there were still many doubts about their choices. Shu, after working with her captor for some time, finally realized she was committing a sin by taking innocent lives. In fact, she tried to escape Jia's clutches several times, but each time he managed to hold her back. He simply threatened the lives of her loved ones. To make the woman fully submit to him, Jia reminded her of her 3-year-old son, saying that if she dared to call the police, Her child would be sent to the afterlife that same day. So Shu gradually abandoned the idea of escape and decided to continue cooperating with this monster. However, it was Shu Lixia who broke down during interrogation and revealed the basement in Jia's house. It turned out that the officers showed her sympathy. Seeing the woman shaking, they brought her a quilt and covered her, then fulfilled her request by buying personal hygiene items that Shu needed. The woman confessed that ultimately it was the kindness of the police that broke her. Touched by their care, tears flowed from Shu's eyes. When detectives asked if she wanted to explain anything, the woman raised her head and began to tell a story that even experienced investigators who had seen much in their lifetime weren't prepared for. The unexpected compassion seemed to melt Shulisha's cold heart, and she became the key to solving this case. It was noticeable that after confessing, the woman felt relief, as if she had shed a burden of many years. When Shu was 5, both her parents died, and she grew up with her older sister. The family was very poor, and the girls often went hungry. Later, Shu became a kindergarten teacher, got married, and had a child. But married life wasn't satisfying. The couple often argued, and sometimes her husband even raised his hand against her. This became the starting point. Then Zhu told about all the crimes committed by her and Jia Wengje, revealing where to find the bodies of all missing people. After hearing Shu's explanation, law enforcement didn't immediately believe her, thinking the woman was making up fantastic stories to deliberately confuse the investigation. Nevertheless, the next day, they called the Nihei Police Department and reported the alleged mass grave of missing victims. In the basement of Jia Wenge's house, inside a makeshift well, 42 bodies were found, 24 women and 18 men. Before the police were piled dozens of corpses, most of which had already decomposed, emitting a revolting odor. This was accompanied by the buzzing of numerous flies. No one knew about the homeowner's criminal activities until the day he and 2 accomplices were detained at the station during a routine security check. When this shocking, bloody case was uncovered, the 28-year-old criminal calmly admitted to ending the lives of 42 people. When asked to specify how many victims there actually were, the man dismissively replied that he didn't remember the exact number. According to Jia's own statement, for him, taking a human life was easier than pinching an ant. This not only didn't cause him trouble or guilt, but on the contrary, made him happy. All the criminals, including Jia Weng, Li Xiuhua, and Shu Lixia, were paraded through the city streets. Local residents, learning who was behind all these disappearances, became furious and began throwing stones and anything they could get their hands on at the arrestees. Jia Wenge received a death sentence. He showed no remorse for his actions and even smiled when the judge read the verdict. During the execution on January 24, 1992, to atone for the guilt before the victims, 42 bullets were used for each life taken. Shu Lixia, despite admitting her mistake and telling investigators about the burial in Jia's house, couldn't atone for her crime. In the end, she was also sentenced to death. Before her execution, Shu wrote a letter to her sister, saying she had committed many sins and must die. Nevertheless, she was glad to have put an end to this nightmare in the abyss. It didn't free her soul from torment, but brought some relief. Due to the horrific nature of his crimes, Jia Wengji became known as the South China Ripper. Although he and all his accomplices were executed, this didn't bring peace to the victims' families. As in the 90s when these crimes occurred, today, the city of Nihei still has a bad reputation. Many still call it the city of bandits. This is the end of the story. Like the video and leave your thoughts in the comments. This was Jeremy. See you soon. Can a single individual be present in 2 locations at once? Is this some kind of supernatural phenomenon, or simply an illusion? These were the exact questions running through the mind of a police officer when he encountered a young woman named Sunny Khan. The Orange County residential complex received an alarming 911 call about a potential hostage situation in one of the apartments. The scenario was particularly dangerous as it unfolded midday when children might be playing outside. All the police knew was that two unknown men had burst into an apartment where two female students resided. One of the girls managed to hide in the bathroom and contact emergency services. A police officer, having just arrived at the scene, was sprinting across the parking lot towards the building when he noticed a blue Mustang parked there. In reality, there was nothing unusual about this. As he ran past the vehicle, the officer observed two people inside. A Korean woman was in the driver's seat, with a young man in the passenger seat. At that moment, a radio call came through requesting backup in apartment 676. The officer dashed past the Mustang, making a mental note of the Korean woman's appearance just in case. Black hair, fair skin, brown eyes. Who knows if this information would be useful later, but due to professional habit, he did it unconsciously. The woman called out that her name was Jeena Han. She said she lived in apartment 676, but the officer was already out of earshot. When this officer reached the correct floor, the emergency response team had already forced their way inside. A perpetrator was lying face down on the floor, while two victims, young women, were trying to remove tape remnants from their legs and hair with shaking hands. The students were in their early 20s, both originally from South Korea. The officer approached the women and was overcome by a strange sense of déjà vu. Black hair, fair skin, brown eyes. He asked for the woman's name, and she replied that she was Jeena Han. At that moment, the policeman's mind exploded. The whole situation seemed unreal to him. How could this happen, given his photographic memory? He distinctly remembered seeing this woman behind the wheel of the Mustang, and now she stood before him again, terrified. Friends, over 90% of viewers watch videos without subscribing to the channel. Check if you're subscribed. If not, please be so kind as to subscribe to the channel to support me. Is it possible for one person to be in two places simultaneously? One giving testimony as a victim, while the other sits next to the defense attorneys at the defendant's table. When one starts crying, the other also begins to sob. They're simply on the same emotional wavelength. What is this? A glitch in the universe? The answer to this question is quite straightforward. Before us are identical twins. One sister is in the courtroom as a victim, the other on the defendant's bench, accused of conspiracy to commit violence. One of the most unsettling psychological studies was conducted in the 1960s, when scientists debated the nature of twin upbringing, questioning what exactly influences their developmental characteristics, genetic traits passed down by parents, or if it's all a result of nurture. How do we explain that pairs of twins with identical genetic structures live completely different lives, or conversely, they fully mirror each other's fate? It's difficult to argue, as convincing evidence for either hypothesis is currently lacking. The essence of the experiment was to place twin infants in two different adoptive families and observe how they develop, whether their habits are similar, and how they behave without knowing that somewhere in the world there's an exact copy of them. This study is quite classified, as it's considered unethical. Many of the separated children felt that something was missing in their lives, but couldn't pinpoint what exactly. One involuntary participant in the study learned he had a twin brother, and when they met, they discovered they had essentially lived parallel lives. They both had identical eating habits, disliked condiments and sauces, believing they overpowered the taste of food. Both brothers were passionate about the same sport and even had the same jersey number. This study led to 2 voluntary deaths and ruined the lives of many people. It's very difficult to live knowing you're not whole. At least, that's how most separated twins felt. They couldn't explain this sensation themselves, which led to rather dark thoughts. Sunny and Jeena Han learned of each other's existence when they were about 5 years old. It turned out that two girls who were exact copies lived in the same city. Their parents were well aware of this because after their divorce, they had reached an agreement. 3-year-old Sunny would stay with her mother, while her sister Jeena would live with her father. After some time, Mr. Han met another woman and decided he wanted to start a proper family with her and have children. The man thought it best to return Jeena to her birth mother. At first, it seemed that reuniting was the best thing that could have happened to the girls. Sunny and Jeena were overjoyed to find each other, but life with their mother wasn't as safe. New men constantly appeared in the house, whose names the girls didn't even try to remember. Mrs. Han would sometimes lock her daughters in the house, leaving only a box of eggs in the fridge, and leave the apartment for days, forcing them to somehow survive together. During those times, they were each other's only emotional comfort and support, though it's unclear how this struggle for survival played out. At some point, Mrs. Han developed a gambling addiction and borrowed a lot of money. Her relationships with men in Korea also didn't work out. Her daughters Jeena and Sunny constantly argued, competed with each other, and in the evenings counted the number of bruises, scratches, and hair pulled out from their fights. The woman decided to leave South Korea and move to California. She resolved to leave everything behind, packed up their suitcases, grabbed the girls, and headed for a new life. Although in reality, this new life turned out to be much worse than the one they had in their homeland. They had no money, knew no one in California, didn't speak English, and spent most of their time just sitting at home, not knowing what to do. Mrs. Han began to show signs of mental health issues. When the girls turned 13, their mother decided to leave them with her sister, who lived with her husband in Orange County. She simply dropped them off at a house, introduced them to the owners, and drove away to live her own life. Very often, twins are willing to do anything for each other. Sometimes the opposite happens, when they're ready to do anything just to be better than their exact copy. This is exactly what happened with Sunny and Jeena. The girls studied in the same class, were top students, and yet strongly envied each other. They felt that one of them was praised more by teachers, loved more by their aunt, and in general, one got all the best, while the other had to settle for second place. They were competitors in all aspects of their lives, be it school grades, boys, friends, or physical attractiveness. Moreover, everything came much easier to Sunny. It was easier for her to make friends, easier to get the highest score on a test. But Jeena didn't lag behind. She spent more time preparing for lessons, just to prevent Sunny from surpassing her. And she did everything to outdo her sister. The only thing where she had no chance was becoming Mom's favorite. For some reason, Mrs. Han always loved Sunny more, and on those rare occasions when she visited her daughters, she spent more time with her. The 21-year-old Jeena, after graduating high school with excellent results, enlisted in the U.S. Air Force. After spending some time among military personnel, she realized she didn't want to dedicate her life to it. The Army's demands were too much for her. Trainees had to perform intense physical training 6 days a week, run over 2 kilometers, do 33 push-ups and 42 squats in less than 12 minutes. This only seems easy at first glance, but for unprepared individuals, such physical exertion caused a burdensome feeling of regret about choosing military service. Additionally, there was military training, combat lessons, field preparation, and academic classes. Every second of a soldier's day is planned. If you're defending the nation's freedom, the concept of personal freedom simply doesn't exist. Jeena approached a senior officer at Lackland Air Force Base in Texas and declared her non-traditional orientation. This was her last resort to avoid military service after signing the contract. She had previously tried other methods. She told command that her father was ill, but they didn't care. When joining the Air Force, one must sign a contract for at least 2 years, sometimes 4 or 6 years. From that moment, a person gives their life to the government and can be discharged honorably or dishonorably. Technically, one could flee, but then they'd be found and forced to face a military court. Jeena tried another method, but they requested medical records of Mr. Han's health condition, so openly declaring her orientation was the last chance to leave the military base, as it was incompatible with military service. And Jeena, having nothing to do with people of different orientations, lied to be discharged from the Air Force. Finally left to her own devices, the young woman tried to find work to secure a comfortable existence. She got a job at a casino with a salary of about $20,000 a year, but this was just the base pay. Most of the money came in the form of tips. To increase her savings, Jeena decided to try her luck and gamble at the casino after work. She needed to occupy herself for an hour and a half until her colleagues were free. The girl approached the blackjack table and placed a bet. She didn't even notice how she lost everything she'd earned that day. The next day, barely finishing her shift, Jeena decided to win it back. After all, it can't be that you always lose. Her gambling addiction developed rapidly. Every morning she ran to the ATM to withdraw the cash she had in her savings account and place a bet in the evening. In the end, her losses exceeded what she earned. Jeena didn't realize she was repeating the fate of her own mother. While Mom's favorite Sunny received a scholarship to Lever University, graduated college, and now lived one of those irritatingly perfect lives people love to boast about on social media. She had a cute little apartment in a complex with a pool and gym included in the rent. She drove around in a white BMW, wore designer clothes, dated a guy, and enjoyed life surrounded by friends. At least that's what Jeena imagined as she looked at her sister's photos on social media. Did Sunny ever think about her twin sister? Their paths diverged right after high school. They hardly talked to each other and never called because Sunny was too busy creating her perfect life. This was a very painful contrast to Jeena's life, who by this time had ended up behind bars several times for theft. The girl was in debt, having become addicted to gambling, and felt inferior to her sister. 5 minutes can change your whole life. That's what Jeena thought. If she had been born 5 minutes earlier like Sunny, her fate would have been different. And now, it wouldn't be her, but her sister looking at social media photos and envying a perfect life. It was because of these 5 minutes that Mom always loved Sunny more, because in Korea, there's a hierarchy. Those who are older always get more respect, even if it's just 5 minutes. From the outside, such thoughts certainly seemed absurd, but Jeena seriously considered her sister guilty of all her misfortunes. They had the same genetics, the same appearance between them. So why should her exact copy get to live and be happy, while Jeena sat and watched? The only difference was in name, everything else matched. So technically, she had a right to that life. All she had to do was become Sunny Han. 19-year-old Helen was lounging on the sofa in the apartment she shared with her roommate. The doorbell was ringing, but she didn't want to let anyone in. The girl had already decided to pretend no one was home, as her roommate was in the shower, and she herself didn't wish to see anyone, but curiosity got the better of her. Helen approached the front door and peered through the glass panel to see a teenager selling magazines. He had already visited them a couple of hours earlier, but apparently had forgotten something. The girl opened the door slightly to inform him of this, and only then noticed a second guy standing off to the side. Helen said they didn't need anything and was about to slam the door shut when the magazines flew to the floor and both teenagers lunged forward into the apartment, shoving the girl inside. Helen began to scream and tried to run into the adjacent room, but they caught up and knocked her to the ground. She felt the cold metal against her left temple and a heavy, strong body pinning her down. A gun was pressed to her head, and she was ordered to be quiet. While Helen was being tied up, she was convinced to keep her mouth shut, promising that everything would be okay, and she no longer had the ability to scream anyway, as her mouth was sealed with a long strip of duct tape. The bound girl heard what the teenagers were talking about. At first, she thought it was a burglary, then decided they were going to assault her. But it turned out the perpetrators were looking for someone. She caught a phrase about how she was supposed to be home alone. Only then did Helen realize that the intruders weren't interested in her, but in her roommate. Meanwhile, the other girl came out of the shower and heard Helen's screams. She quickly pulled on some clothes and pressed her ear to the door. Instead of her roommate, she heard two male voices in the other room. The student grabbed her phone from the bed, darted back into the bathroom, and barricaded the door. With trembling fingers, she dialed 911 and reported the attack to the dispatcher. As soon as she hung up, the door burst open from a powerful blow. The young men dragged her out of the bathroom and began to tie her up. Helen took advantage of the moment when no one was looking at her and tried to escape. However, the guys were quicker. One of them rushed to cut her off and blocked her path to the exit. At first, both girls were laid face down on the bed. Then, apparently changing their minds, they were dragged into the bathroom. The roommates sat side by side, shaking with fear. They thought they were about to be killed, and to avoid blood splattering the bed, they were specifically brought to the bathroom. Meanwhile, one of the guys turned to the other and said they needed to go down to Jeena and tell her that Sunny was in their hands. However, her roommate was with her too. But this couldn't possibly happen, because at that very moment, Jeena Han was supposed to be in prison. How could she organize an attack on her twin sister? The Han parents indeed noticed some peculiar behaviors in their children when they were young. They weren't aware of the concept known as twin reaction. Even when separated, if one girl fell ill, the other would also feel unwell. This unique bond between twins can sometimes manifest in rather dark and twisted ways. Certain psychologists assert that twins occasionally experience intense anger and resentment towards each other. The childhood separation of Sunny and Jeena was traumatic for them. When one twin begins to hate the other, the underlying cause of aggression might be a hidden hatred and desire to harm, as if harming oneself. They completely identify with their sibling. After leaving the army, Jeena struggled to find her place in life. Working at a casino only led her to gamble away all her money and accumulate enormous debts. Jeena lost $40,000 borrowed from relatives and friends. This was accompanied by prolonged drinking binges. Once, she stole a large sum from her uncle, which landed her in jail. She was sentenced to 10 days in prison and 3 years of probation. Upon release, Jeena turned to her sister for help. Sunny offered to let her stay with her. For a while, the twins reunited and even managed to find common ground. But the truce didn't last long. The sisters began to quarrel, and it often ended in physical fights. After another argument, Sunny threatened to kick her sister out. Jeena panicked because she had nowhere else to go. She rummaged through her sister's belongings, found her credit cards, took the passport in Sunny Han's name, and stole her car keys, promptly landing herself back in jail because her twin sister filed a police report. Jeena was arrested for theft and sentenced to 6 months in prison. While incarcerated in San Diego, Jeena was allowed to leave the facility for a few hours each day. She used this opportunity to escape and seek revenge on her sister. She was tired of always being in the shadow of cheerful Sunny. Since Jeena lacked serious connections and hiring a hitman required money, she turned to those she could easily persuade to commit a crime. The 16-year-old Archie Bryant and 15-year-old John Syret readily agreed to retrieve items from Sunny's apartment, where she lived with her roommate Helen. When Jeena told the boys she wanted to deal with her twin and promised them $100 each, they didn't think long. They bought tape and rope in advance and somehow obtained a gun. However, once alone with the captive girls, they noticeably faltered. Jeena waited outside in a rented Mustang in the residential complex's parking lot. John Syret went downstairs, sat in the passenger seat to recount what happened. He was displeased that Sunny wasn't home alone. Jeena had clearly forgotten to warn the teenagers about this. At that very moment, police appeared in the residential complex's courtyard. It was the second day of Sunny testifying against her twin sister Jeena Han for conspiracy to harm. When the girl took the stand, she was completely disoriented, spoke incoherently, and looked unpresentable. She wore no makeup, and instead of regular clothes, she had on something like pajamas. The entire courtroom stared at her, unable to comprehend what had happened. Sunny explained that yesterday she had a big fight with her mom, then argued with her boyfriend, and they broke up. Sunny was so angry and upset that she wanted to end her life. So she went to the pharmacy and bought 3 packs of sleeping pills. The girl took the pills and washed them down with beer until she lost consciousness. She was taken directly from the courtroom to the hospital. She couldn't even descend from the podium on her own. If twin reaction requires them to feel each other's pain, then Jeena should have experienced severe distress when Sunny was recovering in intensive care during the trial. However, the Han twin sisters might have differed from most. When one was doing well, the other had to be doing poorly. When one thrived, the other had to sacrifice something. It seems they couldn't be happy and successful simultaneously. Mrs. Han, the twins' mother, remembered her parental duties during the trial. She couldn't even imagine what her daughter was going through at that moment. The woman helped Jeena recover emotionally and morally. She cared for her and supported her in every way. Then she regularly visited her daughter in prison. As for Sunny, Mrs. Han no longer speaks to her. She has a new favorite. During the trial, the public was divided into 3 groups. One group considered Jeena the evil twin and Sunny the good one. Another group supported Jeena and blamed everything on difficult life circumstances. And the third thought both twins were quite strange. The wildest part is that even when Jeena was arrested for conspiracy to harm, she used Sunny's name. The police asked her name and Jeena said she was Sunny Han. She was slowly stealing her twin sister's identity before she could take her life. A spectacle arose in court when both girls introduced themselves as Sunny Han. They couldn't even be distinguished by DNA test, because everything about them was identical. Sunny's past aroused great public interest. It seemed that while one sister constantly got into trouble, breaking the law, developing a gambling addiction, and lying to avoid military service, the other studied at Lever University on a full scholarship. She lived in a nice apartment in Irvine, drove her white BMW, and was law-abiding, the good and bad twins. But then the public learned that Sunny actually had her own crazy criminal history. Sunny and Jeena lived parallel lives. After successfully finishing school, their paths diverged, and the sisters moved apart. Jeena signed a military contract, while Sunny enrolled at Lever University, but ultimately dropped out. In school, when the sisters competed, Sunny was quite competitive, but after parting with Jeena, she lost motivation to study. The only thing that concerned her now was keeping up with the young people of Orange County, many of whom were wealthy. University tuition was $55,000 a year, plus food, housing rent, transportation, and all personal expenses. Sunny's classmates drove nice cars, with their parents paying the rent for them. No matter how hard the student tried to earn money to look no worse than others, it was an impossible burden for her. Part-time jobs didn't bring in much money, and she couldn't get a high-paying position due to lack of time, experience, and education. Whatever Sunny did, she couldn't afford to live like her classmates. At first, the girl started disappearing on weekends. Her friends thought Sunny had a new boyfriend, but then discovered she was working as a dancer in a bar in a neighboring town. Sunny couldn't accept the idea that she was worse than other students and eventually became so engrossed in this that she lost her scholarship, dropped out of university, and from that moment, everything went downhill. She was arrested after stealing her friend's credit card and going shopping, buying designer lingerie, shoes, and sunglasses. Sunny spent several $1,000s and upon arrest insisted to the police that her friend had given her the card. Jeena had the same attitude every time she was arrested, so Jeena felt worse than Sunny, and Sunny felt worse than everyone else. They both didn't know the difference between wants and needs, and their desires simply spiraled out of control. Although the twins were formally separated after school, they continued to live parallel lives, committing very similar crimes. The Korean-American community rallied together and sent a letter to the judge requesting leniency for Jeena. They claimed that fights between siblings were part of Korean culture, and this had been exaggerated and dramatized by American police. Naturally, in Korea, it's not accepted for one sister to attempt to take the life of another, or even for brothers to hit each other in the face. But the Korean community actively wanted to support Jeena. Most surprisingly, over time, Sunny began to support her sister as well. Sunny's first day of testimony was consistent. She testified against Jeena as the key witness, but midway through the process, the girl began to change her story, or at least her attitude toward the crime. Sunny told the court she didn't believe her sister intended to take her life. Jeena herself explained her behavior by saying she just wanted to retrieve things from the apartment, claiming her sister wasn't answering calls and didn't want Jeena to come. They were arguing, so one decided to teach the other a lesson by sending two guys to tie up the owner and scare her a little. Jeena herself was surprised why the teenagers pulled out a gun. When Sunny was asked how she now felt about her sister, she replied that she wanted to do everything possible to help her. The two guys who staged the apartment takeover are the most mysterious part of this case. They were fully confident in the operation's success. Archie was in charge because he had the gun. He ordered John to go get Jeena, who was waiting in the car. While one teenager ran off, the other decided to help himself to something valuable. He began rummaging through the girl's things and grabbed a pager and a small amount of cash. When John reached the Mustang in the parking lot, he and Jeena saw police arrive at the house. A police officer running past them received a radio call, and Jeena heard her sister's apartment number. She shouted to the officer that it was her, Sunny, and that she lived in apartment 676. But he didn't hear her anymore. Archie was still in the student's apartment and had no idea the police had arrived until there was a knock at the door. The teenager, sure it was John and Jeena returning, turned the lock. He found himself face to face with 4 officers holding guns at the ready. After a moment of confusion, the teenager slammed the door, rushed to the emergency exit, and fell right into the hands of law enforcement waiting for him there, while Jeena and John simply vanished. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you like this video. It's really important. The girl had no intention of returning to prison. On the way, they stopped at a bank and managed to withdraw $5,000 from Sunny's account. Then the accomplices headed to a car dealership to buy a $40,000 Nissan. Jeena's initial plan was to drive to Mexico, buy a plane ticket, fly to South Korea, and start life anew. However, her plan began to crumble at the point of purchasing the new car. When filling out the credit application, she answered questions as Sunny. Then she'd forget and start answering about herself, cross everything out, and write anew. The dealership salespeople immediately questioned how one could forget standard things about oneself. The dealership told Jeena they needed to wait until tomorrow. But Jeena didn't have time for that. She well understood that the police were now looking for them. So Jeena and John headed to a car rental agency, returned the blue Mustang, and tried to rent a new car. They were sitting on a couch at the rental agency when they were arrested. 2 factors made this arrest quite difficult. First, Jeena kept insisting she was Sunny Han. Second, Archie and John were minors. Archie was 16 and John was only 15. Jeena was 23 at the time, and they had met just 2 weeks before the attempted attack. Jeena Han was in prison. She had several months left of her sentence after stealing a total of about $40,000 from her uncle, the man who raised these girls and gave them the love and care they could give to parents. Jeena's cellmate said she behaved very strangely. She talked incessantly about how she couldn't stand her twin sister and wanted to see her dead. Jeena was only interested in Sunny, her gold jewelry, and money as a means to go to South Korea and start a new life. Since Jeena was sentenced to only 6 months, she was allowed to leave the correctional facility for 5 hours a day for work and then return. This was done so that former inmates could easily integrate into society after their release, and Jeena used these 5 hours to escape and attempt to send Sunny to the afterlife. She realized she would be sought for escape, so she decided to steal her law-abiding sister's identity. The fugitive hitchhiked and headed to California. She had nowhere to stay and no opportunity to get a job, so Jeena ended up in a shelter where she met 16-year-old Archie. The boy's parents suffered from addiction and didn't care for their son at all, so he had to make his own way in life. He practically grew up on the street. The only person supporting him was his best friend, an American named Jonathan Sirat. They were like brothers and trusted only each other. Archie was intrigued by the adult Asian woman who arrived in a blue Mustang. There was an air of mystery around her. The young people talked, and one day Jeena suggested they drive to Irvine to retrieve things from her sister. The girl motivated the teenagers with money, promising to give each one $100 if they could help her. On the way, they stopped at a store and bought everything necessary, as well as a stack of magazines to use as a ruse. When Jeena stated that they needed not just to retrieve things, but also to take her sister's life, the boys were noticeably frightened. They weren't prepared for such a turn of events, but were afraid to argue with Jeena, considering her insane at that moment. Meanwhile, the girl talked through each part of her plan, explaining in detail what the teenagers should do. The only thing she didn't anticipate was that Sunny wouldn't be alone in the apartment. Between themselves, the boys decided they would retrieve the things, and Jeena could deal with her sister on her own. But their plan didn't work the first time. Sunny opened the door, saw the boys with magazines, and quickly slammed it shut, shouting that they didn't need anything. Then Jeena insisted they try again, and as soon as the lock opened, to force their way inside. Later, Sunny and Helen reported that the boys, especially Archie who had the gun, were visibly shaking. He looked so scared that at first, the roommates thought he was under the influence of some drugs. In reality, the teenagers were simply afraid. They had never broken into someone's home or taken hostages before. Archie subsequently refused to plea bargain in court, based on the fact that he didn't intend to take anyone's life. The court assigned Jeena a psychologist, and she was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder with antisocial traits. The girl emphasized that her mother was neglectful and cruel, and she had always been afraid of her, claiming this was the cause of all her psychological trauma. Mrs. Han believed her daughter and recognized her mistakes, so she did everything to make Jeena feel her care during the trial. The woman stated that she doesn't divide her daughters into good and bad twins. She loves them equally, and if she had the opportunity to raise her girls in a more stable family environment, the situation wouldn't have spiraled out of control. In the end, in May 1998, Jeena Han was found guilty of conspiracy to attempt murder and sentenced to 26 years in prison. Archie Bryant was sentenced to 14 years in prison as a minor, but was later released on parole. 15-year-old John Sirat received 8 years, but ultimately served 4 because he didn't threaten the girls with a gun, but simply broke into someone else's home. In prison, Jeena earned an associate's degree in social and behavioral studies. Sunny visited her in prison and left with tears in her eyes because she felt sorry for her sister. The girl told reporters that it was she, Sunny, who envied Jeena because she was much smarter. Sunny gained some fame for a while, often being invited to various shows to share her story, but then interest in her sharply declined. Jeena Han was released on parole after 20 years in 2017. Once free, she continued close communication with her mother. Now the former inmate is working towards an engineering degree and building a stable career. She takes care of her elderly mother, who still suffers from alcoholism and gambling addiction. Mrs. Han completely forgot she had 2 daughters. When asked about Sunny, the woman stated that she might no longer be alive. In reality, As soon as Gina's life began to improve, Sunny was arrested for providing intimate services, thus confirming the theory that both twins couldn't be happy simultaneously. Why did the closest people to each other, such as twin sisters Jeena and Sunny Han, become practically enemies? What served as the starting point for their mutual hatred? Nature or nurture? We can only speculate about this. This is the end of the story. Like the video and leave your thoughts in the comments. This was Jeremy. See you soon. 2012, Salt Lake City, Utah. 15-year-old Annie Kasprzak hurriedly changed clothes, pulled out a pre-packed backpack from under her bed, tucked a note beneath her pillow, and cautiously exiting her room, quietly left the house. The home where she had been content for the past 5 years. Ahead lay her own family, and for this she was prepared to leave her foster parents and siblings. The girl swiftly ran towards the Jordan River, anticipating her joyful future. She had no inkling that right there, in just a few moments, she would encounter her demise. Grace Kasprzak, known to everyone as Annie, was born on January 10, 1997. Unfortunately, the family she was born into proved troubled, so her parents lost custody. Annie was removed and placed in foster care. As it happened, by age 9, the child had been returned to the orphanage 9 times and given to different families. The foster parents who rejected the girl so often caused her to develop trust issues. Arriving at new homes, Annie no longer believed she would stay and behaved accordingly, as if testing her foster mother and father's resilience. She desperately wanted her own family and a stable environment, but apparently not everyone was willing to invest time for the child to feel genuine care and affection. Most found it easier to give up on the troubled girl than spend time on her upbringing. After Annie was returned by the 9th family, Veronica Kasprzak appeared on her horizon. The woman worked in child and family services in Utah. Her duty involved finding homes for abandoned boys and girls. Veronica was very passionate about this work and dreamed that every child would have all opportunities in life, despite their character or health issues. She was known as the most caring and compassionate person imaginable. A particularly close relationship developed between Veronica and Annie. The woman knew and saw how much the girl had endured at such a young age. In January 2007, when Veronica was 6 months pregnant, she and her husband Dennis decided to bring Annie into their family. At that time, the girl had turned 10 years old. By the time of the adoption, when all the paperwork was finally completed, the Kasperzaks already had 2 little sons, and the whole family welcomed the girl with open arms. Annie deserved to have a home, parents who wouldn't abandon her, and 2 younger brothers who adored their older sister immensely. Annie truly felt part of a loving family for the first time and was very happy. She went on her first vacation trip, received lots of Christmas gifts, and learned what parental love was like. Friends, over 90% of viewers watch videos without subscribing to the channel. Check if you're subscribed. If not, please be so kind as to subscribe to the channel to support me. It so happened that Veronica and Dennis later divorced, but they maintained a healthy relationship. The man visited the children and participated in their lives. After some time, Veronica remarried a man named James Bratcher. They settled with the children in a quiet suburb of Riverton, Utah. Dennis Kasprzak also remarried. Annie also spent much time with her foster father and his new wife. Now the girl had 2 families where she was genuinely loved. Veronica's new husband, James Bratcher, simply adored Annie as if she were his own daughter. He was ready to fulfill any wish of the girl so she could persuade him to do anything. Once, the girl saw bright red sneakers in a shoe store. Annie was so thrilled with them that her stepfather gifted them to her for Valentine's Day in 2012. By this time, Annie had turned 15. She was a freshman at Summit Academy in Draper, Utah. Like most teenagers, the girl enjoyed listening to music, spending time with friends, and adored animals. Annie performed very well in school and dreamed of becoming a psychotherapist because of everything she had endured in childhood. She wanted to help other children, just as her mom Veronica had helped her. This girl had so much unexpended love that she was ready to share it with everyone. Annie was completely unable to hide her feelings and emotions. If she disliked something, she would say so directly. If she was charmed by something or someone, she likewise didn't conceal her experiences and gave herself to it entirely. In her teenage years, relationships with boys entered Annie's life. She had a boyfriend whom she was madly in love with, and judging by her stories, the young man also had warm feelings for her. On March 10th, 2012, Annie stayed home to watch her brothers, while Veronica and James went out for dinner. When the adults returned, everything seemed normal. The girl went to her room to listen to music, and Veronica headed for the shower. James was putting the boys to bed at this time. It was a typical Saturday evening in their home, with no signs of trouble. When the woman finished her shower, she peeked into her foster daughter's room to wish her sweet dreams. However, Annie wasn't in her bedroom. Veronica called for James, and together they began to wonder where the girl could have gone in the past half hour. At first, the parents thought Annie was playing a prank on them, hiding somewhere and watching as they ran around the house in panic. But then James found a letter on the girl's bed, hidden under the pillow, where she explained everything. The message stated that Annie had made some mistake, lied to her mother and friends about a couple of things. Now she felt guilty, so she decided to go to California to escape her shame. She had only lied to elicit sympathy. And now, feeling out of place here, the girl asked not to be searched for. The fact was that about a month before this, Annie had experienced her first intimacy with a young man. For some reason, she decided she was pregnant. She broadcast this news to the whole world, although later she took a test and it turned out negative. Moreover, after this, Annie started taking pills to prevent pregnancy. So this whole story was just a product of an affectionate teenager's imagination. The girl had dreamed of her own family since childhood, where she would love her children more than anything in the world, and took her wishes for reality. Annie wasn't pregnant, but still lied to her friends that she was expecting a child. Although now she had a wonderful family and great parents, but childhood sufferings had left their mark and caused deep trauma in the teenager's life. After reading the letter, Veronica and James immediately contacted the police. While law enforcement officers were responding to the call, the parents began phoning all of their daughter's friends, trying to find out where and with whom she might have gone as night fell. They also reached out to Chris, Annie's boyfriend, whose full name was Darwin Christopher Bagshaw. The young people had met in math class and started talking. Then their communication grew into a relationship that had been on and off for the past year and a half. Annie wasn't just in love, she was obsessed with this boy. Chris was at home. He told Veronica he didn't know where Annie was, but the girl had mentioned planning to run away with some guy named LJ. This name was unknown to both her mother and stepfather. The teenage girl didn't tell her parents about all her friends, so the information Chris provided wasn't helpful. Soon, the police arrived at the Kasprzak's home to file an incident report. While the officers were talking to Veronica, James managed to track Annie's cell phone location through a special app. Judging by the speed of movement, the girl was traveling by car, and then the phone signal suddenly disappeared. It was likely turned off. While the police were searching for the runaway, Veronica took a photo of her daughter and went to the supermarket near where the mobile signal had stopped. The distraught mother walked around the store parking lot, showing Annie's picture and asking passers-by if anyone had seen this girl. Having no success in her search, Veronica returned home and kept dialing Annie's number again and again. But all calls were immediately forwarded to voicemail. The parents were terrified. They reassured themselves that Annie was a teenager, that she would hang out for a while and come back home. But somewhere deep inside, a terrible thought crept in that they might never see their grown child again. Unfortunately, their worst-case scenario wasn't far from the truth. The very next day, March 11, 2012, the emergency service 911 received a call from a random person jogging along the riverbank. The runner noticed blood traces on a pedestrian bridge over the Jordan River in Draper. The man first assumed it was animal blood, but down by the water lay a shoe, also stained with something dark red. So he decided to report the find to the police. Experts arriving at the scene tested the blood and confirmed it was human. Police immediately began searching the river. Some officers combed through nearby bushes along the shore, while a police helicopter surveyed the area from above. The helicopter had been in the air for just under an hour, when about a mile north of where the shoe was found, officers discovered a girl's body stuck in the river among branches. She wore a red and white shirt, and on her foot was a red sneaker, similar to the one the runner had noticed. Divers were sent to retrieve the bloodied and bruised body. When the corpse was on shore, catastrophic facial bruising was evident. It became clear that the girl had been severely beaten. The subsequent autopsy confirmed that the cause of death was blunt facial trauma. The victim had multiple forehead fractures and an almost complete absence of the nose. The girl's face was so disfigured that it was utterly impossible to identify her. One of her nails was bent. Characteristic wounds on her hands indicated that she had defended herself during the attack. Media reported that it was an Asian woman in her 20s. Veronica and James saw these reports on the news and thought the description didn't match their daughter. But then the police held a press conference and shared some investigation details in an attempt to identify the victim. They simply hoped that someone might be able to recognize the deceased by her clothes or shoes. As soon as Veronica and James saw the red sneaker, they immediately recognized it. It was the very shoe that the stepfather had given Annie for Valentine's Day, a month earlier. Veronica immediately called her mother and asked her to take the boys for a while. The woman already suspected that her girl was no longer alive. Although Annie didn't match the description of the victim found in the river, she had several distinguishing features. The girl had had her gallbladder removed, leaving her with a scar. She also wore braces. Everything matched. The subsequent DNA analysis helped to accurately identify the body of the runaway Annie Kasprzak. In fact, she was unrecognizable due to severe facial damage. The only thing reminiscent of the girl they had lost was a cute dimple on her chin. From that moment on, the investigation into Annie's deliberate killing began. Detectives tried to gather as much information as possible from friends and family of the deceased. Law enforcement also searched the girl's room for any clues that might help with the case. Investigators thoroughly examined Annie's personal diary, where she wrote repeatedly about her love for Chris Bagshaw. The girl described how she wanted to get pregnant by him on her birthday, detailing how she dreamed of the family she didn't have in childhood. There was also a diary entry from March 1st, 2012, where Annie wrote that she was carrying Chris's child. This information intrigued the detectives because, apparently, the girl wasn't pregnant. She had taken a test, was on birth control pills, and had written to her parents that she had lied to everyone about being pregnant. The autopsy also confirmed there was no pregnancy. So this entry could very well have been just a fantasy of Annie's, who passionately dreamed of having a baby. Veronica and James told police they had spoken with Annie's boyfriend, Chris, who said their daughter planned to run away with a young man named LJ. On March 14th, police naturally questioned Chris. Since he was a minor only 14 years old at the time, his father Darwin was present throughout the interrogation. Chris told investigators that he and Annie had slept together once, about a week before the tragedy, and generally met a couple of times a month. The boy was well aware of Annie's pregnancy, but insisted it was probably LJ's child. A month earlier, the girl had been telling everyone she was pregnant because she had slept with a 17-year-old guy named LJ. According to Chris, Annie had secretly brought him to her parents' house back in November, but didn't want her father and mother to know about it. The girl didn't want to disappoint the people who had taken her into their family. Chris himself had never seen this guy and only knew about him from his girlfriend's words. During the interrogation, detectives asked Chris routine questions. For example, when he last saw Annie. Chris said it was on Wednesday or Thursday, but they talked on the phone on Saturday, the night the girl disappeared. He was also asked where he was on Saturday. Chris said he wanted to hang out with a friend, but that friend wasn't home, so he stayed overnight at his grandmother Wilma's house. Chris's father Darwin and his grandmother Wilma confirmed this, so Chris Bagshaw had a solid alibi for the night of the crime. The young man agreed to provide a DNA sample and all the clothes and shoes he wore on Saturday evening. Chris warned investigators that there might be a few drops of blood on his shoes. The last time he saw Annie, her nose had started bleeding and some blood got on his sneakers. They were at his friend Spencer's house when it happened. Naturally, the police checked everything. Friend Spencer told the same story. The guy, by the way, also had an alibi. He was at the gym with his brother. He didn't know anything about LJ either, had never talked to him, never met him, so he couldn't provide any additional information, except that this mysterious person was part of some gang, and once LJ had threatened to come and send Chris to the afterlife. At this point, all leads were pointing to LJ, but the police had no idea who this guy was. They didn't know his full name or where to look for him. All that was known was that Annie had fallen for an unsuitable person who might have taken her life. The detectives returned to the Kasprzak house to re-examine the deceased girl's room and her diary, and they did indeed find evidence that LJ actually existed. Annie had dedicated a poem to him, addressing him by his full name. So now the detectives knew that LJ stood for Leon Gendon. However, even knowing the full name, the police still couldn't track him down. The guy wasn't listed in any police system databases. Therefore, the authorities decided to hold another press conference, trying to find any suspects, witnesses, or learn any information about LJ, and the appeal to the public bore fruit. A witness came forward who knew this person. The woman's name was Joanna Franklin. She had been arrested on fraud charges in the neighboring city of West Jordan, and she claimed to know LJ. According to her description, the guy looked about 19 years old, was short in stature, Latino, but appeared light-skinned. Joanna Franklin also claimed that she had witnessed Annie's killing and was ready to tell the police all the details if she was granted immunity for other crimes she had committed in West Jordan. According to Joanna, they were at the house of a 31-year-old illegal substance dealer named Daniel Ferry. He was a gang member with a long criminal history, so he was well known to law enforcement. On Saturday evening, Annie came there with LJ. At some point, they secluded themselves in the bathroom, after which the homeowner said he also wanted to be alone with Annie. The girl laughed and refused his advances, and he grabbed her by the neck and pushed her into the wall with such force that blood spurted from her nose, mouth, and ears. Joanna wanted to approach to help the girl get up, but she wasn't allowed to do so, being sent to another room. When she returned, the girl was lying unconscious on the floor and was very pale. 3 guys, the apartment owner Daniel, LJ, and another man, loaded the girl into a car and drove her somewhere. Joanna was able to give a full description of Annie's clothes and shoes in which she was found, but never called her by name, just recounting details of that night, referring to that girl. The men returned a few hours later. LJ's girlfriend wasn't with them. When Joanna asked where she went, the homeowner allegedly said that the girl decided to take a little swim. The police obtained a warrant to search the house where all this happened, but found that cosmetic repairs had been done inside very recently. The walls were hastily painted, floor coverings removed, but there were still red stains on the doors that looked like blood. All this confirmed Joanna's story. Moreover, the homeowner was known to the police for his cruelty. Daniel was arrested and brought in for questioning. Surprisingly, the man agreed to talk to detectives without a lawyer, and claimed he had no idea what they were asking him about. He was genuinely confused, saying he didn't know either Annie or LJ. When shown a photo of Annie, he mistook her for some other girl. However, Daniel Ferry's bewildered appearance didn't convince the police of his non-involvement. When told that the teenager in the photo had been brutally beaten and left to die in the river, the man demanded a lawyer. He told the detectives that he had enough sins to his name, but he never hurt little girls. The authorities had Joanna Franklin's testimony, a hastily renovated apartment, and bloodstains on the door, but all assumptions were shattered by the forensic examination, which revealed that the stains on Daniel Ferry's house doors weren't blood at all. It also turned out that on the night Annie was attacked, the man was in a completely different place, so no evidence linking him to the assault on Annie was found, except for the witness's statement. Months passed, and the police still hadn't found new evidence against Daniel. Detectives decided to question Joanna Franklin again. The woman confessed that she had tried to accuse Daniel in order to get revenge on him. She was angry about being cut out of a deal and made up the whole story. In fact, that night, Joanna did witness an attack and abduction, but it was somewhat different, and Daniel Ferry wasn't involved. To make her story convincing, Joanna studied Annie's case and changed some details, adding descriptions of clothing and shoes mentioned at the press conference. On March 3, 2013, the police department fully exonerated Daniel as a suspect in the investigation of Annie Kasprzak's death, and detectives returned to square one. They had spent a whole year searching for evidence against this man, all to no avail. Annie's case remained unsolved for the next few months. There was no progress, no new suspects. The case was passed from one detective to another. The very first investigator who had been searching for the criminal died in the line of duty, so all his work was lost. Most of the information the investigator had went with him. The case was transferred to Detective Jacqueline Moore. With only official documents at hand, Jacqueline couldn't immediately make sense of everything. Meanwhile, Annie's family started a public campaign. They appeared in the media, held a picket, and organized a press conference on the anniversary of Annie's death at the bridge where the girl was killed. The parents wanted to pressure the authorities and inform the public that the case was still unsolved. They also offered a reward for any information that would help find the perpetrator. Detective Jacqueline Moore had to tackle the new case on her own. She reviewed all the gathered evidence, conducted interrogations, and searches once more to identify any leads that might have been overlooked earlier. Jacqueline re-examined Annie Kasprzak's personal diary and discovered that the girl was deeply infatuated with Chris. She was head over heels for this guy. His name was scrawled across every page. This is typical for a 15-year-old in a relationship, but quite odd to be dating another young man and having intimate relations with him. The detective also read in the diary that Annie and Chris had made love about a month before her demise, after which she fabricated a pregnancy. Most likely, the girl was trying to keep her boyfriend close because he didn't share her intense feelings. Then Jacqueline examined Annie's phone records from the day of her death and found numerous calls between her and Chris, followed by 3 calls from a blocked number. A request to the phone company clearly showed that Chris Backshow, Annie's boyfriend, was also calling from the blocked number. It appeared that throughout the evening, they were calling each other and arguing, hanging up, and then immediately calling back. This revelation prompted the detective to scrutinize Chris's phone records even more closely, ultimately revealing that his father Darwin and grandmother Wilma had lied to the police. They had provided him with a false alibi, claiming that Chris arrived at his grandmother's at 7:45 p.m. and stayed at her house all night. His father Darwin confirmed seeing him asleep on Wilma's couch at 11:30 p.m., but Chris's phone records showed that his grandmother called him several times around midnight, then he called her back around 1 a.m. It would be strange to call your grandson if he was sleeping on the couch in the next room. Even if he woke up, they were in the same house. Why not just go and talk to each other? Clearly, something was amiss here. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you like this video. It's really important. Detective Jacqueline reviewed all of Chris's police interviews again and noticed that the nosebleed story didn't add up. According to Chris, a few drops of blood got on his shoes, but the forensic report indicated there was much more of Annie's blood on the footwear than just a few drops. For some reason, the detectives didn't find this odd, probably believing the nosebleed story confirmed by Chris's friend Spencer. Jacqueline examined Spencer's interrogation records and noticed that, at one point, investigators checked the call log on the teenager's phone. There they found a strange message from Chris Backshow, where he told his friend that the police should be coming to Spencer and he needed to verify the story about Annie's nosebleed. The guy complained that his shoes were taken for examination and he didn't want to be accused of anything. In reality, Spencer was asleep that evening and saw nothing, but Chris asked him for a favor. The friend merely told the police that Annie indeed had a nosebleed that evening, but this wasn't true. Detective Jacqueline, latching onto this message, called Spencer in for questioning, and the boy immediately admitted to lying. He hadn't seen Annie having any issues, but believed his friend that it happened. To delve deeper into the case, Detective Jacqueline went and talked to several friends and relatives of the deceased girl and learned shocking information. In fact, there was no LJ. One of Annie's friends revealed that this was what the girl called her boyfriend, Chris Backshow. So all along, the mysterious LJ, whom they had been searching for months, was right under the police's nose. And it was Chris, the guy who had mentioned LJ among the first. Unfortunately, this still wasn't considered sufficient evidence of Chris's involvement in Annie's demise. So Detective Jacqueline paid out of her own pocket to attend a seminar on tracking mobile phones. She underwent specialized training and also contacted an expert. Together they assembled equipment to analyze thousands of Chris Backshow's calls and messages. One call stood out, made to Chris's number at 9 p.m. on March 10, 2012, the evening Annie lost her life. This call came from Annie's mom, Veronica. The woman, having read her daughter's note, was calling all her friends. As it turned out, Annie had come to her mom that morning and said her boyfriend, Chris, had suggested they run away together. Naturally, Veronica first called Chris to find out if they had carried out their planned escape. By calling him, the woman inadvertently cracked the case. When the worried mother dialed her daughter's boyfriend's number, the cell phone was pinged by 4 different towers simultaneously. This meant that the signal strength from these 4 towers had to be nearly identical. Detective Jacqueline and her assistants drove around the area of these towers, trying to pinpoint a location where the signal from all 4 was the same. In fact, there was only one place where this could happen, and it was right by the Jordan River, where Annie lost her life. It appeared that at 9 p.m. on March 10, 2012, Chris Backshow was in the same area by the riverbank. By that time, the young man had moved with his mother to Grand Junction, Colorado. When brought in for questioning, he refused to talk without a lawyer. The young man was extradited back to Utah in October 2014. He still maintained his innocence in his girlfriend's demise. His trial was set for March 2016, with Chris to be tried as a minor. Essentially, this meant that even if Chris was found guilty, he would be released in 4 years when he turned 21. The young man was held in a juvenile detention center awaiting trial. While there, he confessed to another inmate about Annie's demise and revealed all the horrifying details. This inmate then relayed his story to the police. The essence of the crime was that Chris was upset about the rumors Annie was spreading about her pregnancy. He didn't want to become a father at such a young age or take responsibility for the girl and baby. Chris didn't have deep feelings for Annie. She had initiated their relationship. That evening, the boy contacted Annie and asked her to meet him at the Jordan River so they could run away together. When Annie slipped out of her parents' house, she ran to the date straight to the riverbank, expecting to see her beloved. When the happy Annie arrived there, instead of a kiss, she received several blows to the head with a shovel. Chris struck until his girlfriend's face was completely disfigured. And when the girl fell unconscious, Chris placed the shovel against her face and stomped on it until Annie breathed her last. The girl fought for her life as best she could, but unfortunately, Christopher overpowered her and beat her to death. Then, to dispose of the body, he threw it into the water. After this information was passed to the medical examiner, he compared it with the autopsy results. The injuries fully matched the crime description. It was such a brutal and personal way to take someone's life. And all because of pregnancy rumors, although Annie wasn't even expecting. Instead of somehow resolving the issue, this young man most brazenly decided the fate of his girlfriend, who had her whole life ahead of her. This senseless motive provided little comfort to the girl's grieving parents and friends. Annie would never get to start her own family or study to become a psychotherapist to help children in difficult situations. She had just found a real home, loving brothers, and understanding parents. She had just begun living the life she deserved when everything was suddenly destroyed. This confession shocked the entire community, given the ages of the perpetrator and victim. The court granted the motion for Chris Bakshow to be tried as an adult. Just a week before the trial, he changed his plea from not guilty to guilty of intentional killing. His lawyer told the court that Chris wanted to take responsibility for what he had done. During the sentencing hearing, Chris apologized to Annie's family and his own parents. He tried hard to show remorse, but it's difficult to believe he felt any real guilt. The young man had lied to the police and lived peacefully for several years until his lies finally came to light. The day after Annie's body was found, Chris asked everyone to wear red in memory of the girl, as it was her favorite color. He posted on social media about how the world is filled with hate and anger, and no one understands the pain of losing a loved one until it's too late. Chris spoke about how he missed his girlfriend, how wonderful she was, and how they loved each other. This was despite knowing full well who had taken Annie's life. In February 2016, 18-year-old Chris Bakshow pleaded guilty to first-degree felony murder in connection with Annie Kasprzak's death. Faced with irrefutable evidence, he avoided trial by agreeing to a plea deal. Chris Bakshow was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 15 years behind bars. He will be eligible for parole in 2034. Darwin Bakshow, Chris's father, and grandmother Wilma were charged with obstructing justice and giving false testimony. They received suspended sentences. How emotionless and detached must one be to end the life of a girl you'd been dating for a year and a half, while believing she was carrying your child? Essentially, by taking Annie's life, Chris was eliminating two people. In a recent prison interview, Chris said he thinks about Annie every day and takes full responsibility for her death, but he still seems unable to articulate what drove him to commit the crime. Chris has petitioned for release due to mental health issues, but so far these requests have been denied. Annie's family strongly opposes any early release for the person who took their daughter's life. While the justice system attempts to rehabilitate the offender, Annie's loved ones prefer to focus on memories of her and the life she should have lived. She was described as a vibrant, energetic girl who loved dancing, drawing, and spending time with friends. Her untimely death at the hands of someone she trusted more than her parents is a tragedy that shocked society. The Annie Kasprzak Memorial Fund was established to honor her memory and help students who share her interests. A memorial bench was installed along the Jordan River Trail in her honor. Now any passerby can sit, catch their breath, and remember this girl who had to say goodbye to life so early, simply because she loved too much and dreamed of a family. Annie's relatives scattered her ashes over the ocean so she would never remain in one place. Now, wherever they go, they always feel Annie is with them. Veronica Kasprzak remains as caring as ever towards children deprived of a normal childhood. She and James have essentially adopted 5 more children, which was exactly what Annie wanted. This is the end of the story. Like the video and leave your thoughts in the comments. This was Jeremy. See you soon. Are you on good terms with your neighbors or engaged in ongoing conflicts over every issue? Residents of Jacksonville, Florida, called law enforcement more than 80 times to protect themselves from an erratic neighbor. This is the wild tale of Russel Tillis. In 1987, while working as a nurse, a young woman named Terry met Russel Tillis, a patient who came to inquire about tattoo removal in the clinic office. The man appeared incredibly attractive to her, with beautiful, well-groomed hands, neatly styled hair, and his entire appearance exuding self-assurance. Russel was not only handsome, but also extremely charming. During his time in Terry's office, he managed to pay her more compliments than she had heard in the past year. Before leaving, the man asked for her phone number in case Terry agreed to go on a date with him. The woman blushed deeply and wrote down the coveted digits on a piece of paper, which would later change her entire life. On their first date, Russel behaved like a gentleman, further winning Terry's heart. He presented her with a bouquet of flowers, held doors open for her, and generally conducted himself as one should treat a lady. To some, this might not seem particularly unusual, but for Terry, these small gestures of attention equaled grand gestures. She wasn't accustomed to being put first or told how beautiful she was. So on the date, she truly felt special, perhaps for the first time in her entire existence. Noticeably relaxed and already mentally making plans for a future life with Russel, Terry shared a bit about herself. Her childhood couldn't be described as happy. She had been through a lot in the past, and now, looking at the attractive man across from her, she already envisioned him as a knight in shining armor who had appeared to protect her from everyone, whisk her away to his castle, and show her what true love looks like. However, perfect people don't exist, and soon Terry became acquainted with Russel Tillis's other side, his aggressive and hot-tempered nature. One evening, during one of their early dates, the couple was strolling down the street. They passed by 2 men standing nearby who made some light-hearted joke about the girl. Terry was expecting her knight to respond with something in kind to put them in their place or, at worst, shake them by the collar. But instead, Russel turned around, pulled back his fist, and knocked the jokester down with one punch. He then shifted his attention to the second man and asked if he wanted to be knocked out too. Terry was a bit taken aback and frightened by this display of brutality, but at the same time tried to convince herself that Russel was just protecting her, defending his beloved girlfriend. Yes, he had gone a bit overboard, but it was only because he liked her very much. The desire to protect her wasn't a crime. Terry managed to reconcile her feelings about the situation, and she succeeded. The alarm signal didn't go off in the enchanted lady's heart. Friends, over 90% of viewers watch videos without subscribing to the channel. Check if you're subscribed. If not, please be so kind as to subscribe to the channel to support me. Just a couple of months after meeting, Russel suggested Terry take their relationship to the next level, starting to live together as husband and wife. He asked her to move into his house, although the young woman had some doubts about relocating. However, instead of listening to her inner voice, she did as her boyfriend wanted. One of the earliest serious warning signs was that the man insisted Terry spend virtually all her time with him. At first, he just got upset when she wanted to go interact with family or friends. Then he began answering phone calls and telling everyone Terry wasn't home, even though she was actually sitting nearby. When the girl's relatives finally met her chosen one, he didn't make any particular impression on them. What Terry described and what they saw differed greatly. They initially felt that something was off about this man. Russel himself wasn't thrilled about his girlfriend's family either. The entire meeting was permeated with mutual dislike. However, in Terry's eyes, this was her man, her chosen one, sent by fate. She planned to build a future together with him. Moreover, her relationship with her family left much to be desired, so their opinion didn't hold much significance for her. Terry introduced Russell to her family as basic etiquette required. Beyond that, she would figure things out on her own. Since Terry was now under Russell's roof, it didn't take him long to drive a wedge between her and her relatives and friends. As soon as he managed to isolate his girlfriend from everyone, he began pressuring her about marriage. When Russell first brought up the topic, Terry wasn't thrilled about becoming a married woman. She thought they should wait a bit. Things were moving too quickly, but soon the young woman learned she was pregnant and decided it was a sign from above. When they got married, none of her loved ones attended the ceremony. This wasn't because friends and relatives didn't want the wedding or didn't support the union. In reality, they didn't even know Terry was getting married. By that time, Russell had simply forbidden the bride from communicating with people from her past. According to Terry, the wedding ceremony without her family became the starting point on the road to hell. However, standing in a white dress, arm in arm with the groom, she didn't yet realize this. Terry and Russell had a baby girl. The new mom was so engrossed in caring for the little one that she didn't immediately notice something strange happening around her. The first thing Terry noticed was that Russell began stealing. First, her ring disappeared, then a pair of diamond earrings. But what she regretted most was the heart-shaped necklace her parents had given her for her 16th birthday. It held great sentimental value. However, Russell cared little about that. He pawned all these jewels to spend money on purchasing illegal substances. When Terry learned of her husband's addiction, she tried to send him to a rehabilitation center. Russell adamantly refused. The distressed woman had no choice but to issue an ultimatum, either the forbidden drugs or the family. But everything went quite differently than she had anticipated. Instead of making an attempt to quit and fight for the family, Russell exploded. He yelled at her to shut up, that his affairs were none of her business, and that she had no right to make such demands. And to ensure Terry would always remember this, he grabbed her by the neck and forcefully lifted her off the floor. The woman lost consciousness. When the young mother regained consciousness, she found herself lying on the floor with her husband standing over her. Terry didn't know how long she had been out, but what struck her most was that her spouse showed no remorse. Essentially, Russell made it clear that she was in his house, and he would be the one setting the rules here. This horrific situation frightened Terry so much that very night, as soon as Russell fell asleep, she packed a bag with essentials, grabbed her daughter, and fled to her parents' house. When she told them what happened, instead of support, her mother and father stated that she should have listened to what they had said. They had warned their daughter from the start that something was off about this man, but she had put on rose-colored glasses and didn't want to see or notice anything. Finding no support in her parents' home, Terry felt she had no choice but to return to Russell. Apparently, her family was offended that the girl had gotten married without inviting them to the ceremony. After returning to her husband's house, everything only got worse. Russell was constantly going out at night. Sometimes he wouldn't show up for 2 to 3 days, disappearing without warning. Terry still didn't know what he did, where he worked, and was afraid to ask. One day, she received a call from the police station informing her that her spouse had been arrested for harassment. Russell had been bothering girls who provided intimate services. When Terry picked him up from the police, Russell denied everything. He said the officers had falsely accused him, and for the first time, the woman actually believed him. But when it happened for the second and third time and kept recurring, Terry barely listened to her husband's explanations. His story never changed. It was the same every time. He had been falsely accused. Russell understood perfectly well that his wife didn't believe him, so when returning home after a short imprisonment, he always brought some gift for her. It wasn't a beautifully wrapped surprise tied with a bow. Most often, Terry received trinkets, random items. These could be various accessories like chains, bracelets, and hair clips. Once, Russell brought her a diary. Since the first pages were torn out, The woman immediately guessed that her husband simply stole all these things from the prostitutes he spent time with. Whenever his wife asked where the gift came from, Russel said he had found it. One evening, Russel brought something for himself, a Polaroid camera. The man ordered Terry to put on makeup and undress so he could take some intimate photos of her. Naturally, she didn't want to do this, but Russel insisted that she had to please her man. In the end, Terry sat with a grim face, showing how uncomfortable she was, while he forced her to strike various uninhibited poses. Although the man tried to compliment his wife, he clearly saw that the photo session wasn't enjoyable for either of them. Eventually, they argued again, and Russel left for the entire night. When their daughter was a couple of months old, Terry became convinced that she really needed to leave this man once and for all. But two significant reasons held her back. Despite his harsh nature, criminal habits, and harmful addiction, Russel fully provided for her and their daughter, paid the house bills, bought food, and necessary items for the baby's care. Terry herself couldn't support herself yet. To go to work, she needed to find a nanny for the child, and to pay the nanny, she needed funds, which she didn't have. She also lacked the finances to leave with her daughter and rent a place. She didn't want to turn to her parents anymore because she expected nothing but reproach in the family home. Another reason was that Terry was very insecure and was willing to put up with Russel's bad temper just to have someone around. She still clung to the hope that her spouse would change and become the man she first saw him as. One evening, Terry received another call from the police informing her that Russel was being released on bail and had been arrested on charges other than his usual ones. Russel had been detained that day for attempted kidnapping and coercion into sexual intercourse. That morning, Russel had gone to work like any other day. After finishing his shift, he got in his car and headed home. On the way, the man noticed a hitchhiking woman who was having car trouble and offered her a ride. But instead of going to the address she gave, he drove to a secluded spot, stopped the car, and tried to attack the passenger. She began to resist and scream. All this commotion attracted the attention of two other men who intervened and prevented the crime from happening. Terry was horrified. Learning of her husband's actions, she felt disgusted with him. The wife hoped that Russel would be sent to prison for some time, giving her a chance to gather her belongings and leave. But Russel only received a suspended sentence, so they both simply continued living their lives as if nothing had happened, not even attempting to discuss what he had done. Soon after, Terry learned she was pregnant with their second child. This pushed thoughts of divorce even further away, as she couldn't run far with two small children. While Terry was carrying the baby, Russel developed a new, disturbing habit. He would take their daughter out late in the evening and disappear for several hours. The pregnant woman didn't know where they went and was afraid to ask her husband. The girl was, unfortunately, still too young to tell where she and her father had been. When Terry gave birth to their second child, this time a son, both parents were overjoyed. Even Russel became kinder for a while, but as soon as the baby's facial features began to take shape, the man doubted that he was the child's father. Russel accused Terry of having the son with her former boss. This was ridiculous because she had no romantic relationship with her boss. However, Russel wouldn't listen to reason, and his possessive instincts grew even stronger. The man told his wife that he wasn't going to lose her to her boss or any other man, and if she ever tried to leave him, he would track her down and bring her back because she was his property. Russel regularly threatened Terry with firearms he kept in the house, and once he took a hunting knife and began demonstrating how it could fatally wound someone. He held the blade against Terry's lower abdomen and showed how to use it. He claimed he wanted to teach his wife how to protect herself and the children from an attacker, but it seemed more like threats toward his spouse than a crash course in self-defense. Russel seemed to be saying, "Look what I can do to you." As a result, this simply added another fear to Terry's subconscious. Several more years passed in constant fear. The woman and two children lived under the same roof with a real monster. not fully realizing the danger they were in all this time. One day, Russel was arrested on charges of possessing illegal substances, and this time he was held behind bars a bit longer than usual. While he was in prison, Terry decided to take the opportunity and finally leave him. She moved with the children to a one-bedroom apartment. This was all the woman could afford at the moment. The closer Russel's release day approached, the more fear Terry felt. She tried to go out as rarely as possible to avoid accidentally running into him. However, she knew it was only a matter of time. One day, returning home with the children to their small apartment, Terry found a folded piece of paper in the door. It was a handwritten letter from Russel with threats. He frightened her, saying he would report to Child Protective Services and take custody of their son and daughter, then deal with their mother. Terry, after reading the message, wanted to pack up again, grab the children, and go somewhere far away. Unfortunately, she didn't have the financial means to do so. The woman was lucky that before Russel could do anything, he was arrested again and put behind bars for several years. So Terry seized the moment and contacted a lawyer, asking to prepare divorce papers. Russel was served the documents in December 2011 while he was in prison. By the time he was released, Terry had already moved from the small apartment to a nice house in a quiet neighborhood. This time, Russel couldn't find his wife and children so quickly, so he visited her father's house. Naturally, Terry's father didn't tell Russel anything. Instead, he ordered his son-in-law to stay away from his daughter, who had just managed to breathe freely after escaping from him. But Russel wasn't going to give up. He started apologizing to his father-in-law and crying about how bad he felt for everything he had done, how he regretted his behavior, and how he missed the children and his wife. His act couldn't move the man, and he refused to tell Russel about his daughter's whereabouts. After he left, the father immediately called Terry and warned her to be careful because Russel seemed to be out of prison and was now looking for her. This time, Terry heeded her father's words and became even more vigilant. She always looked around when going outside, but this didn't save her. One day, the woman's worst fear became reality. She saw a car pull up to the main entrance, with Russel behind the wheel. Terry rushed to the backyard where their son was playing, grabbed the confused child's hand, and hid in the house. Their daughter was old enough by then and lived separately. To Terry's surprise, Russel didn't exit the car, didn't try to enter the house, or do anything else. He drove away without incident, as if he just wanted her to know she had been found. After this, the woman never relaxed for a second. She knew that Russel wouldn't leave them alone now. Terry simply waited for her ex-husband to make a second attempt. She checked the door lock several times before going to bed. While at home, she constantly looked out the window. But months passed, turning into years, and Russel didn't appear, and there was no news from him. Eventually, Terry relaxed again and lost her vigilance. However, nothing bad happened to her or her children. The fact was, she now knew exactly why Russel no longer came around or made his presence known. One day, while driving, the woman heard breaking news on the radio. The announcer reported that in Jacksonville, Florida, 55-year-old Russel Tillis had been arrested for kidnapping, murder, and dismemberment. The remains of 30-year-old Johnny Gunther were found buried in the backyard of his mobile home. According to the medical examiner, the victim was buried shallowly. The preliminary version suggested that Gunther had been hit on the head with a heavy blunt object, possibly a hammer, at least 5 times. During a 3-day search of the property, 4 different burial sites with the woman's remains were discovered. When Terry heard the shocking information on the radio, she couldn't believe her ears at first. The woman called a friend and asked her to check the news on TV, hoping it was some kind of mistake. But in reality, this was just the tip of the iceberg. Later, Russel Tillis confessed that he had 5 more women whom he held as hostages and used as slaves to satisfy his intimate desires. The man called his home a house of horrors and described his misdeeds in detail. In addition to Russel himself conducting lengthy, brutal sessions with the women, he also brought his friends and allowed them to act out any of their sick fantasies for a fee. So who is Russel Tillis, and what contributed to the emergence of such horrible tendencies in him? Russel David Tillis was born on April 22, 1961. As a child, he lived in the same house of horrors with his brother Claude and parents. His father, Claude Sr., worked as a crane operator and participated in the initial construction of the old Disney amusement park. However, he was an alcoholic, and, while in a drunken stupor, not only subjected his wife to intimate violence, but also molested his own sons. When Russel's mother learned what her husband was doing to their two sons, in an attempt to protect her children from the hell inside the house, she sent the boys to live in a trailer in the backyard, forbidding them to open the door to their father or to appear in the house themselves. Margie Tillis, Russel and Claude's mother, was considered a wonderful woman, but her husband was a completely different story. Neighbors feared this man just as they would fear his son years later. As Russel grew up, having never seen a normal life, he turned to petty crimes and forbidden substances. He attended a special school for troubled teenagers. Looking at his entire childhood, he had no chance of becoming a normal person. Nevertheless, Russel, with his mother's help, managed to overcome his addiction to hallucinogenic substances and moved to California to start a new life. There, he met a 16-year-old girl, Shannon Brinkley. She was 3 years younger than Russel. The young people met at a party at the Social Security office and quickly got along. Less than a year later, Shannon became pregnant and gave birth to a child, a son. Soon, she began to suspect that Russel was sometimes a bit out of his mind. It turned out that the young man was making his own happy pills and testing their effects on himself. Russel and Shannon didn't live together for long. As soon as the girl learned about the forbidden substances, she took their boy and left. Shannon feared that their son would grow up to be like his father. After this, Russel decided to return home to North Florida, where his parents and brother lived. In Jacksonville, he got a job as a general laborer at a construction site and was able to rent his own place. It was during these years that he met Terry. One night, Russel was driving on the interstate highway and decided to act as a good Samaritan, picking up a woman whose car had broken down. He offered to take her to the nearest gas station, but instead took her to the construction site where he worked and then attacked her. As we know, the woman managed to escape, and Russel only received a suspended sentence for this assault. However, this punishment didn't scare him, and Russel continued his criminal activities. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you like this video. It's really important. In 1993, he served a brief stint in prison for burglary, after which he vanished from police radar for nearly a year. Subsequently, Russel received another 5-year sentence for breaking and entering, as well as car theft. The man utilized his time behind bars to study legal texts. Apparently, he hoped to avoid future punishment using his own knowledge. In March 2006, Russel, by then released, picked up a 14-year-old girl who was walking home after missing her school bus. He drove her to a secluded spot, struck her, and ordered her to undress. The schoolgirl, terrified and unable to think of a better option, decided to save her life in an unusual way. She claimed to be a sex worker, stating that force was unnecessary, as she would willingly do whatever he wanted. After escaping her abductor, the girl reported the attack to the authorities. A sketch was created, and they managed to obtain the perpetrator's DNA sample, but he was only found 2 years later. Russel denied the kidnapping charge, claiming he had picked up a prostitute and was unaware she was underage. For this, he received a 4-year prison term. Upon release, Russel returned to his mother to comfort her in her final days. The woman was suffering from terminal cancer and had divorced her domineering, cruel husband, though they continued to share a residence. Russel himself was also divorced at the time. Seemingly caring for his mother distracted him from his ex-wife. Claude Sr. was partially wheelchair-bound in those years, but this did nothing to diminish his malice. It only intensified it. Russel, now back home, deeply resented his father and, as an adult, attempted to avenge his difficult childhood. Neighbors overheard loud arguments and fights between father and son coming from the Tillis house. Despite his disability, Claude Sr. could easily grab a weapon or knife, and his son was equally matched. Such behavior between two family members further deteriorated Margie's health. In 2012, the woman lost her battle with illness and passed away at 69. She left the house to her son Russel, who evicted his elderly, disabled father. From that moment, the nondescript building in the green suburb gradually transformed into a house of horrors. Over the next 3 years, police were called there more than 80 times. Neighbors avoided Russel's dwelling. They constantly heard some machinery operating on his property. Screams periodically emanated from there. Women frequently visited, some staying, while others were never seen again. Occasionally, Russel's guests would leap over the fence, desperate to flee this terrifying place. Sometimes they knocked on neighbors' doors seeking help. The neighbors themselves were mortally afraid of Russel. They lived in fear. Some even filed court orders for protection from this strange individual, as he threatened to end their lives and bury them in his own yard. Suburban residents noticed new structures appearing on the property of the ill-fated house. Meanwhile, the house itself aged and deteriorated. The surrounding area began transforming into a dump, accumulating garbage, old broken equipment, car parts, and various useless junk. Neighbors tried contacting local authorities. As a result, city building inspectors forced Russel to remove one of the illegal structures. But that's where it ended. To shield himself from prying eyes, he erected a tall fence in front of his house and installed gates with a padlock. Later, he covered some buildings with tarpaulins to conceal activities inside. Russel harbored resentment towards his neighbors and began making their lives miserable. The man installed a siren on his property that emitted loud sound signals at periodic intervals throughout the night. By morning, residents couldn't take it anymore and called the police. However, Russel managed to remove everything and disappear somewhere. Patrol officers would knock on doors, file reports, but leave without results. Then Russel set up bright floodlights on his property, directing them at night into his neighbors' windows to deprive them of sleep. When he tired of this, he would wander the neighborhood in the dark, frightening local residents. Russel would shout profanities at them, humiliate and insult them. Since police took no action against the unruly neighbor, Russel felt emboldened. Learning about the restraining orders, Russel became even more enraged and threatened his neighbors, saying he owned the area and could do whatever he pleased there. After Russel landed behind bars for a week for stalking a neighbor, he began employing the same tactics. He started filing complaints against local residents, claiming they were harassing him. The man openly mocked his neighbors, convincing them that while in prison, he had thoroughly learned all the laws and now knew how to apply them. Although the court dismissed all complaints since Russel simply didn't show up for the hearing, neighbors tried to avoid crossing paths with him to prevent a new wave of appeals. Even when taking out trash or dashing out for the newspaper, people always glanced around warily. From 1994 to 2012, spanning until his mother's death, Russel Tillis faced charges for 9 different criminal offenses and served time in state prisons on 4 occasions. The accusations included solicitation, burglary, abuse, kidnapping, assault, and brawling. Life behind bars didn't frighten this individual at all, and he did everything to make others' lives as miserable as possible. In 2014, Russel Tillis again received a restraining order from his neighbors for stalking and threatening behavior. For refusing to comply with directives and keep away from these people, he was arrested in February 2015 and spent 7 days in jail, but this didn't deter him. On May 28, 2015, shortly after midnight, Jacksonville police arrived at Russell's house to serve 2 outstanding warrants for violations. Officers had come earlier that day to apprehend Russell on a warrant, but he managed to elude them. So now they returned after nightfall, planning to trick him out of the house and catch him off guard. Law enforcement officers positioned themselves in a vacant lot, observing the dilapidated mobile home. One officer began tossing rocks onto Russell's roof to force him outside, where an ambush awaited. In fact, the police were well acquainted with the situation, having responded to endless disputes between Russell and his neighbors for years. Moments later, police saw a motion sensor light flicker. Russell was running through a neighbor's yard, trying once again to escape. They gave chase, cutting off his path, but the man began swinging 2 knives, preventing officers from approaching, before abruptly changing direction and running the opposite way. Detectives pursued Russell across the yard, but soon realized he had fallen into his own trap. It turned out that the homeowner had booby-trapped the area around the house to prevent any of his captives from escaping. Razor blades and boards with protruding nails stuck out of the ground throughout the yard. These obstructions blocked the property owner's path. Russell knew about the sharp objects hidden in the ground, so he didn't risk venturing into the backyard and consequently fell into the hands of the pursuing police. They surrounded him, arrested him, and sent him to jail. Additionally, he was charged with aggravated assault on law enforcement officers, resisting arrest, and battery. Russell later justified himself, claiming he didn't realize in the darkness that police were chasing him. They were dressed all in black and had no identifying marks as law enforcement officers. The man was convinced that some wrongdoers were throwing stones, trying to break his window and enter his house, so he got scared and wanted to flee. After Russell's arrest, his neighbors were overjoyed and recalled the horrifying moments they had faced over many years. They didn't yet know that they had rid themselves of the House of Horrors owner forever. The true extent of his crimes came into focus a bit later, when Russell's cellmate, Sammy Evans, informed authorities that Russell had confessed to killing and dismembering a woman he'd buried on his property. This woman was Johnny Lynn Gunter. She had grown up in foster care and later began selling her body to fund her illicit drug habit. Sammy Evans agreed to conduct another conversation with Russell while wearing a wire so detectives could gather additional information. On the recording, Russell described keeping women chained up and allowing others to have intimate relations with them for money. His brother Claude was one of the men who visited to satisfy his urges. Gunter was among the women held captive. When Gunter learned about Claude, the brothers decided to eliminate her to avoid future complications. According to Russell, it was his brother's idea, but Claude couldn't go through with harming the woman, so the task fell to Russell. He was the one who struck Gunter, causing her death. Afterward, the brothers dismembered her body and buried it. Subsequent investigation uncovered decomposed remains hidden beneath mines and traps. The victim was indeed identified as Johnny Lynn Gunter, a 30-year-old woman with a history of substance abuse and sex work. On December 8, 2016, Russell was charged with murder, kidnapping, and human trafficking. By then, he was already incarcerated due to multiple violations of neighbors' protective orders. When Russell's trial began, he claimed that his initial confession and everything he told Sammy was fabricated. He said he only did it to receive a death sentence. At the time, he was severely depressed and had attempted to take his own life unsuccessfully. At one point, the detainee was indeed hospitalized for 3 days after overdosing on antidepressants, which is why he and Sammy Evans devised this plan. Evans was facing life in prison, and Russell promised to help him get a lighter sentence if he acted as a fake informant. Russell assured Sammy that he had thoroughly studied the law during his time in prison. He felt he had lived a good life and didn't want to spend the rest of his days behind bars. He'd rather end it all at once. According to Russell, there was no House of Horrors. He was an innocent man. In reality, his brother Claude had shown up at the house with Johnny already dead, and asked for help disposing of the body. Russel claimed he had no idea how this woman met her end, but wasn't planning to testify against his brother. The prosecutors didn't call Claude Tillis as a witness, and he wasn't charged in this case. The jury felt this was just Russel's last desperate attempt to shift blame to his brother and save himself. Russel's trial process was very lengthy. Years passed between his arrest and the trial's conclusion. The man pleaded not guilty, and after prolonged proceedings, his trial only began in early 2021. Eventually, jurors spent 5.5 hours deliberating before delivering a not guilty verdict on the human trafficking charge, as there was no tangible evidence for this. However, Russel was found guilty of kidnapping Johnny Gunter and taking her life. Russel was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. Plus, he received an additional 30 years for abuse of human remains. After Terry learned what a repulsive person her husband was, she thanked God for avoiding the fate of being buried in this monster's backyard. It was very difficult to recognize a criminal in the seemingly well-mannered, respectable man. Before being swayed by charming courtship, Terry needed to know who he really was. But sometimes women's desire to have a strong shoulder beside them overrides the voice of reason. This is the end of the story. Like the video and leave your thoughts in the comments. This was Jeremy. See you soon.